Hello, algebra students. Directions tell us to factor z cubed minus 2z squared minus 3z. Now I'll remind you that factoring is the opposite of multiplication. And you might say like division, and I would say, yeah, kind of like division, except for it's not an operation. Basically what it is we're pulling apart what you guys might think of as the answer, a simplified expression, and we're turning it into the product of factors, basically trying to turn it into numbers multiplying. And you can see that that's what all these answers look like. They look like something multiplying with something else, something multiplying with something else, or in the case of C and D, three things multiplying. That being said, there's a lovely way of factoring that you're going to need to know for college. It's actually a bunch of different methods, and I usually tell you I'm not going to cover them, but I will cover them this time. But first I'm going to use that little cheat method of working backwards, guessing and checking. So let's guess an answer. Let's multiply it out to see if it simplifies to this expression and go about it that way. And then afterwards, I'm going to show you a couple of college skills of factoring. So here we go. I'm going to multiply this guy. Let's see. Z times z is z squared. Z times negative 3 is negative 3z. Positive 1 times z is plus z or plus 1z. And positive 1 times negative 3 is negative 3. Combining these two like terms here in the middle, I get z squared minus 2z minus 3. Now, this is kind of working, except for my exponents. I have a z squared, they have a z cubed. I have a 2z, they have a 2z, I should say a negative 2z squared. I have a negative 3, they have a negative 3z. Something I notice is that all of their terms have one more factor of z than I do. Let me say that again. All their terms have one more z than I do. I had 2, they had 3. I had 1, they had 2. I had none, they had 1. So that tells me we need another factor. We need a z. So that kind of leads me to want to look at c. Let me show you what I mean. There's a z plus 1 and a z plus 1. There's a z minus 3 and a z minus 3. But then look, an extra factor of z to multiply in. Let's try c. So let's just clear up that mess. We said A doesn't work, and we're going to try C. Now, this is just as if you had like 3 regular numbers multiplying. You would only do 2 at a time. So that's what you're going to do with these when you have 3 big, ugly algebraic factors as well. Okay, we're only going to do 2 at a time, and it doesn't really matter what order, but I'll just start with those 2. So that's a z shoved up against a parentheses, so I can just distribute that one z. So z times z is z squared, and z times positive 1 is just positive z. And then that whole group still needs to multiply with the second factor, z minus 3. And now let's do that. Z squared times z is z to the 3rd power. Keep passing that out. Z squared times negative 3 is negative 3z squared. Z times z, positive z times positive z is positive z squared. And z times negative 3 is negative 3z. You ever say something so many times it stops making sense? It's kind of what z is doing for me right now. All right, once again, we do see like terms in the middle there. There's some number of z squareds and some other number of z squareds. Let's combine them. I have negative 3, and then I get 1 or plus 1. I end up with negative 2z squared. And then I have a z cubed and a minus 3z. And look at that. Now my 3 terms check. X cubed term, negative 2z squared term, and negative 3z. Gorgeous. Correct answer here is C. All right, that's really all you need for the GED. But if you're college bound, follow along with me. This isn't going to be an in-depth study, but just kind of give you a little bit of an exposure to what you're going to see in college. All right, there's different kinds of factoring. There's different ways to pull apart these polynomials, trinomials, binomials. There's ones with 4 terms, and you'll learn to factor lots of them. But we're just going to look at 2 things. The first thing we're going to look at is pulling out a common factor. We call that a GCF, or a greatest common factor. Just like you can pull out a greatest common factor from the top and the bottom of a fraction, you can pull out the greatest common factor from every term in a polynomial. And remember what we noticed when we were doing it the other way. We noticed that all 3 of these terms have a z. They all have a z. And so what I can do is I can literally pull that z out front. And yes, it is like an act of division now. But one way I just kind of think of it is I'm just removing one of the factors of z from each term. So if I had 3 factors of z here, I will now just have 2 factors of z. And if I had a -2 with 2 factors of z, I'll still have a -2, but I'll just have the 1 factor of z. And then here, if I had a -3 with a factor of z, and I divide out the factor of z, all I'll have is a -3. Okay, I've done the first type of factoring that this particular example needs, and that's pulling out a GCF. And that's what you'll always check for first when you use your different methods of factoring in college. Now, next thing I'm noticing is that this that I have left is a trinomial. It has 3 terms. And as we've been multiplying and multiplying and multiplying trinomials, we've seen that a lot, I should say, as we've been multiplying and multiplying and multiplying binomials together, we've seen that they pretty much always, with a few exceptions, but pretty much always with the ones we've seen, simplify to end up being trinomials because the middle terms combine. So we're going to use that to our advantage, okay? We're going to pull it back out, assuming, well, yeah, that probably came from a couple of binomials multiplying together. And we know how we get our first term, right? We've always gotten our first term there by multiplying the first and the first. And so that's what we're going to do. We're going to pull that apart. If we have a z squared here, it probably came from a z multiplying by another z. Okay, cool. Now, same thing with the last term. We know where the last term comes from, the plain old number in this case. It always comes from the last term times the last term. So I'm going to think about ways that I could multiply to make -3. There's 2 ways. Either it's a +1 and a -3, or it's a -1 and a +3. So those have to be the numbers over here. A 1 and a 3, and I just am not sure about the signs yet. So how do I know about the signs? That's when we look at this middle term. Remember, my 2 middle terms, the one where I multiply the z by the number here and the z by the number there, those are the ones that have been combining and combining to make the middle term. So I have -2z here. So I want to have more negatives than positive. So I'm going to turn my 3 to be negative and my 1 to be positive. Now you might say, that was a lot of ninja magic, Kate. Yeah. You'll practice this again and again in college, but I just want you to see something. If I were to multiply these back together, I would get a z squared, a -3z, a positive z, and a -3. And again, see that. See the z squared, see the -3, and see the 2 combining to be -2z. I have properly factored this. Okay, tricky. Little taste of what's to come in college, and kind of just let it wash over you because we haven't practiced these skills individually. And the nice thing is when you go into college, you'll practice one way at a time for a while before you start comboing them all. But I thought for my advanced students, a nice little preview would be great. All right, super proud of you guys. You're doing great work. Happy learning.